Connecticut has a higher percentage of Puerto Rican residents than any other state in the country. That's according to data from the 2020 U.S. Census. But Puerto Rican residents still make up less than 10% of the state's population. So how then do Puerto Rican people in Connecticut find community? From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about community and belonging. Later in the show, we hear from a sociologist who says Asian Americans don't need to assimilate into the predominant U.S. culture. But up first, Rachel Iacobone. Rachel is the Puerto Rican Communities reporter for Connecticut Public Radio. Rachel, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want our listeners to get to know a bit about you. You've been at Connecticut Public for a little over a year now. Share with our listeners your role as Puerto Rican Communities reporter.
So my focus is the diaspora here because we have the largest proportion, which is a weird word, I know. People are like, what does that exactly mean? Of Boricuas. So to put that lightly, there's some states like New York that might have a larger number of Puerto Ricans, but here, by the percentage, we make up much more of the population. So 8% is the official number from UConn's Puerto Rican Studies Initiative, but that is probably an underestimate, is what the head of that, Charles Venator Santiago, says, what a lot of academics say. It is probably a lot more, but even if we are just, quote unquote, 8% of the population, we are about half of the Latino population here in Connecticut. So it is thriving and robust. I'm from South Florida, and I grew up around a lot of Latinos, not Puerto Ricans, but I spent all my breaks from school up in the north, where my family was in Jersey and in New York, Spanish Harlem and the Bronx mostly. And I've been around a lot of Puerto Ricans, and moving here, even my times on the island, I sometimes am shocked by when I'm in Frog Hollow on Park Street and how many of us there are.
Let's talk a bit about your experience coming here to Connecticut. I think, as someone who is a transplant to Connecticut, I had a particular vision of what the demographics would look like in Connecticut. And it is nothing like what I have lived and experienced here in the state. People have a very singular vision of Connecticut. And so you mentioned New York and New Jersey, which when people are talking about the tri-state, they don't always think about the diversity that exists within Connecticut. And for a small state like Connecticut to have such a large Puerto Rican population really says a lot about the history of those communities and their current impact. How did your impression or sense of those communities change from someone who visited the area to now someone who lives here in the state?
When I got here, I had to really reckon with, wow, what a large population we have here. This is definitely the most Puerto Ricans I've lived around. It's the most that I've been in the grocery store, on the street, hearing our dialect of Spanish. My part of South Florida is Southwest Florida, and it is majority Mexican. So I grew up hearing a lot more of the Mexican accent, but also dialect. There's word differences that we use in Spanish, and certainly a large Cuban population in that area as well. So hearing here, like, oh, this is the language I hear at the dinner table at home. These are the word choices that we use. People accuse us of the choppy Puerto Rican Spanish. We leave out like the S's at the end of words. Sometimes we get rid of a syllable in the middle of the word because who cares? It makes it faster. We're certainly not as fast as Dominicans speaking Spanish, but it does feel very familiar. And that was like a warm welcome for me. I think the secondary part for me was once I really started covering this community, was realizing even within that broad and very interconnected community, there are these other pockets of different things. So, we have people who are very proud of their Taino heritage. We have Afro-Boricuas and their traditions. And we also have, like, one of my favorite restaurants in the state is La Borichina, which is a Chinese and Puerto Rican restaurant. And we have a very large Chinese population on the island, but I've never seen that really transferred outside of the island. It's just like when you're there on the island, you can go to a Chinese restaurant and get your mofongo with your lo mein. And that happens here. That's in Waterbury.
I love the intentionality of the name of your position and of your beat being Puerto Rican communities, as opposed
Hmm.
to promoting this sort of singular monolithic view of a community. You have just spoken to some of the tremendous diversity that exists within these communities, whether it is a person who grew up on the island or a person who grew up here on the mainland. When you think about the Puerto Rican communities here in Connecticut, what are the other layers of diversity or difference that you say, look, we really need to pay attention to this because it speaks to how people are living and experiencing every day beyond the very narrow conception that many people have of what it means to be Puerto Rican?
Yeah, some of them are those race and ethnicity, designations I was talking about, but also it is just that if you look at a lot of the data, still Puerto Rican population here is making a lot less money than other populations in the state. That parallels in, kind of a depressing way, the difference between Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the US, and the rest of the country's states. So if you compare the state level, kind of treating Puerto Rico as a state here, the population there, is making somewhere in the 20,000s. 24,000 was the last number I saw, I believe, for a household of four. When you're looking at Connecticut, the average household income like that is closer to 90,000. If you layer that with Puerto Ricans here, they're still making very much a fraction. A lot of people came over too. There's been the waves of migration, right? So it's not just the initial large push of people coming here, similar to, the American dream coming to New York. And even though we are US citizens, it is very similar to an immigrant story, especially then. This is, the 1940s. There's a lot of technical stuff about this, but when we became a U.S. territory in 1917, it didn't automatically give you birthright citizenship. You were somewhere between where you had it retroactively. And so in the 40s, that becomes as soon as you're born, you have full citizenship. But of course, not presidential voting rights is something that comes up a lot, right?
Mm.
So those layers exist, and then something like Hurricane Maria happens, and we have people who have been here now for generations because they came here for that American dream to work in tobacco farms largely, and then it spread into other industries. But you've had these like Connecticut Ricans since 30s, 40s, even further back, and then you have people who are coming here because of tragedy like Maria, and there is a difference. Even people talk about this in language levels. The language that Puerto Ricans who have been here for a long time, if they still speak Spanish, there's data that only about 60% of us are speaking Spanish, but those who know Spanish usually learned it from our grandparents in the diaspora. And so we're speaking Old Spanish. So when we meet Boricuas who have recently moved over, we are using kind of dated language. Like if you were talking to someone in English, that they were speaking almost like that mid-Atlantic accent, and that they're using these terms like from the 50s, the equivalent of basically calling someone a square. I realized someone was saying like, why did you use that? And I was watching this interaction at like a Piraguas shop here in Hartford, which is like our shaved ice. And it was one was raised in the diaspora and was very proud of the fact that like, hey, I still know the language and I learned this from my grandparents. And the other is like a recent kind of, again, sort of an immigrant, right? And watching them interact and have the same accent, I would say, and most of the same words, but have these moments that are kind of funny because we are not as directly connected to the island. So a lot of my role has been trying to do that, right? Like, how do we take care of each other when certain things happen in both directions, when things happen here in Connecticut, but also when things happen on the island?
I shouldn't be surprised, but yet I am always surprised and disappointed when people do not realize that people who are Puerto Rican are U.S. citizens, full
Yes.
stop, and yet do not have the full rights, privileges, and benefits that accompany U.S. citizenship. And so you have people saying, look, we are American too, treat us as such. And I wonder, given those differences between that sort of legal status and legal standing, and some of the generational differences that you have mentioned, how are people finding community and connection in spite of, and in some ways because of, those differences? What are you seeing?
A lot of people are more vocally pro-independence of the island. In my experience growing up, a lot of people were somewhere in the middle, a lot more pro-statehood, I think, when there was a perception that, or more of a perception that becoming a state had more benefits. And I think particularly Maria seemed to change a lot of minds on that. The U.S. response to that disaster, the fact that I know my family in some parts of the island did not have power for a year and a half afterward. And the official count just being in the teens of how many people died in Maria, but the less official counts by folks on the island is in the thousands. So that type of tension in modern time has really shifted a lot more people toward we should take care of ourselves. And even within that, though, there's arguments trying to figure out your own identity. I think that a lot of my coverage has been surrounding, in I would say a very positive way, of course, the fact that there is this diaspora tribe of Taínos. There's an argument by some that can you have a tribe if it is not in the place that you are from? And they would argue that they wanted to stay. Most Puerto Ricans don't come here, don't come stateside because they wanted to leave. Their ideal world would have been to be able to stay in their home, but the cost of living disasters when they hit caught up with them. So they moved stateside and then trying to find community the same way a lot of Americans are doing, DNA tests and things like that have, I would say, illuminated a lot of people to, these things that I saw in my abuela's house growing up that felt a little different than, say, like the Spanish traditions of the island was totally indigenous. Taino population, or the native Puerto Ricans. When I say Boricua as our like term for our group, it comes from the original name for the island in the Arawak language, which is what Taino spoke, which is Boriquen, So there's been a lot more reclaiming. So there's a lot of pride of our indigenous roots now. I think that was not the case. Like lots of Latin Americans, there was a time, I think, when the proximity to whiteness was more important. So saying that they're Spaniard, which is European, was better and more palatable. Certainly over the course of my life, I've seen an increase in people really embracing and relearning traditions like their Taino heritage, the Hiwayawa tribe that is here from, I believe, Philly all the way up through Maine. It's like all of the Northeast. Then there's also the Afro-Boricua movement, where a lot more people are realizing and embracing the fact that, there used to be a lot of colorblind racism. Oh, we're all an equal mix of these three things. Or we are all just Puerto Rican. Let's ignore what our roots are. And no one sees a difference. And it's like phenotype even. People were experiencing, of course, a very different thing if they looked more Afro-Boricua to the world versus more Spaniard, right? I am noticing a lot of people reintroduce those traditions. They're taking things like a bomba class, and bomba is the Afro-Boricua genre. A lot of drumming, a lot of the things, the movements that you make are like wide hip movements, swinging skirts that are coming from Africa.
I'm old enough to remember when English-only legislation was first passed in your home state of Florida. And for many families who had tremendous pride in who they were and their heritage, not teaching their children to speak Spanish was a way of survival because they didn't want them to speak English with an accent or to be perceived as less than. When you think about this role that you have as Puerto Rican communities reporter for Connecticut Public Radio, you think about the beauty of these communities that you are not just covering, but really connecting. What is it that you want our listeners to know about Puerto Rican communities here in Connecticut?
I think the first thing that always comes to mind for me is that we are not a monolith, that there is so much diversity within the group. This is similar to when I tell people you can't visit a city for a weekend and know everything in it. Even a year in, even being from the background that I am covering, I do not know everything about Boricuas here. There are so many corners of the state and so many experiences, but it has been such a welcoming state. I've noticed, at the education level here, even so much bilingual education that happens for students. So if you are a recent transplant to the state from the island, you have a lot more support than you would, like you're saying, in Florida. When I was growing up, You were very much encouraged to only speak English, but also if you marked when you were enrolling a student that they spoke Spanish at home, they were automatically put into ESOL, and they were not allowed to unenroll for 4 years. And while in that program, we're not allowed to test for the gifted program. We're not allowed to test for anything else. So if you had any special accommodations, ADHD, for example, those were not allowed to be tested for. So these students really fell behind. My parents are educators, and my mom listed me as white, knowing that in that school system, and did not change it until I was entering high school when I was no longer at risk of being put into ESOL. Meanwhile, my dad, by accident, he didn't think about it, even though he was in the school system, he enrolled my little sister in school and had put Latina and had marked that we speak Spanish at home. My mom had also marked that we did not speak Spanish at home, even though it wasn't true. And my sister got put in ESOL, and they had to go to the administrative center and remove her from that program. And the only reason they were able to was because they worked for the school system. If not, my little sister would have been in that program for 4 years. And I had many friends who were Latino, including 2 Boricuas. My grade only had 4 of us, and 2 of them were in that program and were not able then, because of the elementary school experience, to be in advanced classes with us in middle school, to be in honors classes with us in high school, or in AP courses. I went to college early through a dual enrollment program. They were not even qualified for that. So it becomes a generational thing, right? One of those friends has children, and now she's thinking about it. She's still in our home area. And we've kind of talked one-on-one of things have changed and things have gotten better, certainly, but I'm still not marking that my kids speak Spanish at home because I have those fears. So here, because of the support and the number, when you have more numbers, the experience is very different. I've had many thoughts while I'm reporting on this communities, like we've been saying more accurately, what my life would look like if I'd been raised in Connecticut as a Boricua. I think in some ways, 2 Boricuas, what I would say I want us to know about our community is that here we have it so good. And I think we might take that for granted because it's just what you grow up with and you're used to. And yeah, we're the majority, no big deal. But it is so isolating to be so far. It feels crazy for me to say that Connecticut, of all places, feels so close to home because I'm just thinking even the weather, right? My first New England winter was so brutal. And I was thinking, how did all these Puerto Ricans from an island in the tropics come here and survive in this winter? But even within that, they have so much more support than they do in, pockets of Florida like mine that were definitely majority white. And of the Latino communities, they were in the minority. So we didn't have that cultural connection. You couldn't go to the grocery store and pick up your ingredients, and you couldn't eat at restaurants and find your food. And I think I was in late teens the first time I went to a Puerto Rican restaurant because I could just have it at my abuelos down the street. And I was sitting there eating, pateles, our holiday tamales, and it clicked for the first time in my life that every restaurant I'd gone to probably was serving their holiday food. I had never thought about the fact that what we serve in restaurant spaces is our best and most special foods because I never had Puerto Rican food at a restaurant, and suddenly it made all other restaurant experiences and food make sense to me, which is I ended up being a food reporter a few years later, but it really is a unique population here and something that folks who grew up here are so lucky to have.
When you think about what it means for you to be a reporter, to be someone who has such deep affinity, connection, and love for these communities, what's one word that comes to mind as you think about your role?
Togetherness. Unity came to mind as well, but I don't think we're always unified, and that's okay. Despite the differences, within these communities, we have slightly different backgrounds, all of us. There is an agreement that we're going to, fight the good fight together.
Well, I hope that we continue to aspire and strive for that togetherness, to affirm the beauty and importance of community, especially as these communities continue to thrive. Rachel Iacovone is Puerto Rican Communities reporter for Connecticut Public Radio. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up, a sociologist talks about the idea of making a decision not to assimilate. She was inspired by her grandmother.
And I was really reckoning with her legacy too, and how she was what many would call a quote difficult woman, how she in many ways was unassimilable. She refused to cooperate in more ways than one. And I really wanted to honor that.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the complexities of community and belonging. Bianca Mabute Louie grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, just outside of Los Angeles. Many communities across the region have a high proportion of Asian American residents. Bianca writes about how Chinese banks, grocery stores, churches, and hair salons have all proliferated across the region. It's an experience that shaped her book, Unassimilable, an Asian Diasporic Manifesto for the 21st Century. In the book, Bianca develops the idea of intentionally not assimilating into the predominant U.S. culture. It's an idea that has sparked debate amongst Asian Americans about how to build political power in the U.S. Bianca Mabute Louie is a sociologist and author of Unassimilable, an Asian Diasporic Manifesto for the 21st Century. A note for our listeners, we recorded this conversation back in 2025, so you may hear some references to things that happened that year. Bianca, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
When you started writing the book, we were in a very different political moment. I would say the political moments in the United States are never easy for certain communities and for certain people, but we are definitely in a different space right now. Share with our listeners what was happening at the time that you were writing the book that inspired you to write it and to really put it together for others to engage.
Sure. Yeah, I started writing it in 2021, which, like you said, was not just a different time period, but feels like a different world and dimension. At the time, we were having this kind of national racial reckoning with Black Lives Matter. I specifically started writing the book about a month after the mass shooting in Atlanta that targeted several Asian women. And around that same time, my maternal grandmother also passed away. And during that time, right, I had come up beforehand as an educator in Asian American studies. I was very involved in Asian American organizing. So I was really paying close attention to how my community was responding to this national racial reckoning. I was doing a lot of stuff on addressing anti-Blackness in our community. And then with the rise in hate incidents and with the mass shooting, I was doing a lot of educating about anti-Asian violence as well. And I was paying really close attention to how certain narratives were emerging from these social movements, essentially, and noticing that, right, like there are some of us who were defaulting to this kind of good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, this sense of, we don't deserve to be hate crime because we're Asian Americans. We helped build this country. We built the railroads. We're good immigrants. We're educated. We're assimilated. And we belong here and we're from here. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I was also just feeling like, well, didn't we just come off of a racial reckoning where I thought collectively kind of understood a bit more about how racism is embedded and baked into this country? And for me, I was like, I don't think I want to belong here. I don't want to belong here, right? This kind of, as the contradictions of this country are becoming exposed, and I think now even more so in 2025, where we see everything kind of unraveling and exposing themselves to what they have always been, right? So I really questioned this urge to prove our belonging. And at the same time, I mentioned earlier, my grandmother had just passed away, and I was really reckoning with her legacy too, and how she was what many would call a quote difficult woman, how she in many ways was unassimilable. She refused to cooperate in more ways than one. And I really wanted to honor that. And I felt like thinking about her legacy and the trajectory of the Asian American community, this politic of refusal kind of emerged from all of my reflections. And this politic of refusal is not new. It comes from and is grounded in a lot of Black radical traditions. But I wanted to think about what refusal and refusing to assimilate could look like for us as Asians in the US. And so the book starts out with my grandma in the first Asian ethnoburb where I grew up in San Gabriel Valley outside of Los Angeles, and provides this roadmap and proposition that what if we thrive and we create our own belonging, not by assimilating and cooperating with the American empire and agenda, but actually by refusing to assimilate and refusing to cooperate with it. And I feel like that message, even though we're in a different world now, feels even more urgent today.
For many of us who grow up in what people would call quote unquote ethnic communities, we are taught that the polite thing to do is to not voice that, especially outside of the community. How did writing this book help you work through some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very kind of personally liberating because as I was writing it, I also have been going through my own doctoral program where I didn't always feel like I belonged. I'm the first in my family to go to college. And I think in these institutions, there's a pressure and a compulsion to assimilate and to cooperate and to prove that, like, you know, you didn't make a mistake letting me in, and I feel so lucky to be here, right? And I'm going to prove and show you that, like, I'm worth the investment or whatever. But as I was going through this process of the PhD, you inevitably see a lot of different sides of academia. And again, I think student protests over the last year have also shown that to us, right? That these institutions are not at all flawless, but are actually very complicit in a lot of systems of violence. And so in writing this book, I really was confronted with what does it mean to exist in these spaces, but to the best of my ability, say no when I can, right? Say no to patterns of exploitation and to say yes to hanging on to my own humanity and prioritizing my own community, right? And these systems that want to create, right, these supposedly non-biased social scientists, which is very different from how I was raised and politicized. And I went into the program very much feeling like I have a strong point of view, and that's a good thing, right? But I think in my training, it kind of felt like, no, that's not really encouraged. We want to be scientific and impartial. And so part of the writing this book was standing 10 toes down behind my point of view and saying, actually, I have an experience and I have a proposition for my community. And it forced me to take up space in a way that was very uncomfortable, but felt necessary to kind of survive this doctoral program and this institutional socialization that we go through.
I am smiling as I am listening to you talk about that because so much of it feels resonant to me. It's been 20 plus years, I'm dating myself, 20 plus years since I finished my doctoral program. But I remember that questioning of, do I belong here? And then moving from that to, do I want to belong here? Or do I want to see it as a process, a step to get me toward what I want to do? In all of those ways, I was sharing this with a group of students yesterday. In my first year program review, I keep this piece of paper all this time later. I was described by the review committee as being obstinate because I kept asking questions. Well, the theory says this, but in practice, it looks like this. And having a member of that committee say, well, if she wants to study something worthwhile, she shouldn't study issues of identity because that would be me search.
Yeah.
And to hear you talk about your experience, in some ways it is comforting to know, okay, it wasn't just me, but it's also disheartening in some ways that we have not progressed further. You mention in this book the role of institutions, whether those institutions are the communities, the neighborhoods that we are part of, the role that the church plays in shaping identity, not just the development of identity, but the maintenance of identity. Talk more with us about your experience growing up in the San Gabriel Valley and how those pivotal institutions shaped your approach.
So I mentioned earlier San Gabriel Valley, and there are other geographers and historians who have done work on this, was the first ethnoburb right? So the first non-majority white suburb. And what that meant and what that looked like was that my parents to this day can get around in San Gabriel Valley speaking only Cantonese. They do speak English, but they don't need to.
Mm.
We had our own grocery stores. There are a lot of ethnic churches there. There are medical care providers that speak your dialect. And I talk in the book about how I grew up there, but I went to a very white private school. And, the code switching, that whole thing, I think people can speculate what that was like. But then I found this church that my friend invited me to. It was a Chinese church. And it felt like kind of I could be an integrated whole self again as a young person when I started going at 14 years old. And I felt like I was seen and supported in a way that I wasn't always at school. And I've dedicated a lot of my academic career to looking at these ethnic churches as, again, spaces that sustain culture and ethnic identity and ethnic communities, while also being spaces that are very contradictory. We know that the church as an institution was a colonial tool. And I explore how in these ethnic spaces, how they're both these safe kind of havens, but also extensions of white racial ideologies, even if there aren't white people there attending these. They're also extensions of colonial ideologies and theologies, very kind of homophobic and patriarchal ideologies. And so what that looked like was there was a lot of kind of Protestant ethic stuff of like, we work hard. And there's a lot of research on this too, of kind of the colluding of the model minority myth and we're the hardworking good immigrants with theology, that we take advantage of what God has blessed us with. And, as opposed to, a more structural analysis of how opportunity works in this country.
I'm sure there are people who would listen to our conversation or read your book and say, I don't see what the problem is with saying that, in order to be accepted or in order to be in a broader society, there are certain things you should give up and other things you should take on in order to, quote unquote, play the game like everyone else. What's your response to people who say, I don't understand why you think assimilation in its traditional form is a bad thing?
Yeah, I've gotten that a lot from people in my own community, right? I think it's a larger question of what are we assimilating into? And I think a lot of conversations about assimilation have been, right, like you have to, for the most part, learn English and understand like the customs of the country you're migrating to survive. And we make choices to assimilate because we need to feed our families, right? And I understand that. But what I'm asking is, again, what is the structure we're assimilating to? What kind of compromises and contradictions is assimilation requiring of us? And I'm really asking, again, in this current moment, right? It isn't just the maybe small or large concessions we make from the day-to-day to survive and support our communities. But what are we assimilating into when even we pledge of allegiance, right? I think now more than ever, there's a lot of contention about what this country stands for and what it means and what our tax dollars go to. And again, I think over the years, I've just been like, why do I want to belong to this racist, war profiteering country? And in a lower level, right, and thinking about institutions and universities, even, I've also questioned, do I want to make my belonging and my home here when I know that they will dispose of us if you say, right, words like diversity? When we've really seen how little they value us as people and how little they even value our labor, right? I know, and this isn't just, I feel this very much in the South, right, where it's very intense. So I feel like I'm in Texas and we were kind of the vanguard of like banning all of these things. But also in California, the home state where I'm from, UC Berkeley just handed over 160 names, I think, of faculty members and grad students for claims of anti-Semitism, which we know, right, is very contentious. Right. And even people who are like, yeah, I love America and I'm patriotic and I go along with the program, it doesn't matter. And, they have papers, they have citizenship. It doesn't matter. We just saw in Chicago the other night that several US citizens who are Black Americans had this violent raid in their apartment complex. And so I'm just asking, right, like, what does it take to belong here? And does belonging actually even exist in this current moment? And I call for right this politic of actually refusing to go with the program because I mean, you can be loud and defiant, or you can be quiet and cooperative. In the end, it seems like it doesn't matter.
You have mentioned the model minority myth, which for people who may not be familiar with that particular term, is often this view that I'm going to use this term that I know you do not use. Often the belief that Asian Americans, people of Asian descent, are a model minority in the United States, that they have been able to achieve some degree of economic success, academic success by working hard, by following those rules of the game and being able to progress. And there's so much research that says, while on the surface, people may see that myth as being positive because it lifts up an entire group of people, it's actually quite damaging because not only does it create an unfair expectation or an unrealistic expectation, it also masks the tremendous diversity that exists within communities based on country of origin, time in the United States, all other kind of markers of identity. You in this book intentionally use the term Asian diasporic instead of Asian American. Tell us more about that intentional decision to use the term Asian diasporic.
Yeah. Well, if I may add also to the model minority myth first, a lot of people will cite education outcomes, income outcomes to show Asians are doing the best. What's the problem, right? But people don't realize that the way data is collected is not, there's a story there, right? Income is usually household income, and a lot of Asian immigrants live in multi-generational households where there are many breadwinners because there are many family members and extended family members and generations that they're providing for. When we look at education, post 1965, when immigration kind of opened up permissions for people from Asia to come here, it was highly educated, white collar professional immigrants. And so then if the quote, successful immigrants are the only ones who are allowed to come here, then of course the educational outcomes are going to be higher because they were higher before they even came here, right? So there's a lot of misleading ways that those data points have been used to honestly demonize Black people and other communities of color to say, these people came here without anything and they were able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps while missing huge parts of the story. And yes, in the book, I call for and consider Asian diaspora as a term because I think it goes back to the politic of refusal of what if I don't want to be American, right? And a lot of people have said, if you don't want to be American, then leave. And my response is, yeah, I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what that looks like. But I propose Asian diaspora because I'm really interrogating and asking, why are we in diaspora? Why are we not in our homelands to begin with? I'm not only just rejecting the Americanness part, which I don't know if that's going to get me in trouble, but why are we in diaspora? And the answer to that, if you really study history, is more often than not, we're in diaspora and we're not in our homelands because of the ongoing dynamics of coloniality and racial capitalism that urge us to and require us to be here to have more opportunities for our future generations, right? That doesn't happen by accident. When I propose the term diaspora, that's the question that I ask. And the outcome that I want to push us towards is then solidarity with all peoples who are impacted by colonialism and racial capitalism, which is going to be the masses of the world and the masses in this country, right? Who are not the elite. And I also propose it because I think the term Asian American, it was radical from the 1960s with the Asian American movement to begin with. But as we've seen with a lot of identity politics, it's been kind of co-opted by the elite. It's come to mean Asians can be billionaires too. Asians can be in Hollywood too. And yes, representation is important. But many of us know that it is not liberation and it is not what will materially change conditions for the majority of our people. And so I'm, again, with Asian diaspora, I'm hoping that we move beyond questions of representation and inclusion to actually think about material liberation and solidarity with all peoples who experience similar things.
Coming up, more with Bianca Mabute-Lui, author of Unassimilable, an Asian Diasporic Manifesto for the 21st Century. She talks about how the book might be different if she wrote it now.
I think the message right now is to really hang on to each other. And I validate and hear the fear that people are feeling because I feel it too.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the complexities of community and belonging. We've been talking with Bianca Mabute-Lui, sociologist and author of Unassimilable, an Asian diasporic manifesto for the 21st century. Her book argues that Asian diasporic people in the U.S. can refuse to assimilate as a means of political power. As I spoke with Bianca, I thought about the generational differences in how people might respond to her ideas. I asked how young people can respect the experiences of their elders while also making different choices. A note, this conversation was recorded in 2025, so you may hear some references to things that happened that year.
Yeah, I mean, I was going through that even recently with my own parents who, I mean, they're super supportive. And they came to my book events when I was in LA. But I could also tell with some elders, they were like, it's not that bad here. And I'm like, I think that's not really the point. But I think I have to respect their journey. And I mean, I'm in my mid 30s. And so I have had plenty of years of fighting with my parents about this issue and that issue. And I'm so grateful that they have stayed in the conversations with me when I have not been the best and most gracious teacher, and also come at it very paternalistically, not thinking about things that they have endured, right? And I think now in my life, it's like I'm not really trying to change their minds, but I'm just trying to follow my own convictions and live by example. One thing I do tell young people is that a lot of times we approach these conversations trying to convince our parents or our elders to come to the place that we are, right? Like, come over here and let me teach you and show you all of these things about our country. And please don't vote for Trump next election, right? But I think a lot of times that puts our elders in a really defensive position because who wants to be taught by, speaking for myself, who wants to be taught by a precocious college student? And I didn't, one thing I wish I did earlier was actually ask them their questions about their views. Like, where did you hear, how did you come to believe this? What experiences have you gone through that made you feel this way, right? Over the years, I've learned that my dad worked very close to Compton during the Rodney King riots, and living through that as a young Chinese immigrant informed a lot of his understanding of race. And so then I was able to understand what I was working with. But I will say, I don't know if this generation is different, but it was very cool at my book events. I would actually see a lot of elders and people my parents' age, and they would come up to me afterwards and they'd be like, I'm here because my daughter nagged me to come here. And I'm getting this book signed for her, but actually I'm going to get a copy for myself too.
You also in this book say that unassimilability is distinctly Asian American. What does that mean?
I came up with the title of this book because as a student of Asian American history, the term assimilable has been used and weaponized in immigration history to essentially exclude not just Asian immigrants, but many non-European immigrants. The argument being these communities literally can't assimilate into white Protestant culture, therefore they're not eligible or deserving of citizenship. And so part of it is kind of reclaiming and recalling that history, forcing us to face it and remember it. And that is a distinctly Asian diasporic experience, I think, that many people have forgotten or never learned about. And so part of that is also reclaiming things like the yellow peril stereotype, which was very tied to the stereotype of being unassimilable, that Asians in particular were diseased and threatening. We honestly still see these yellow peril stereotypes directed towards Chinese international students and professors right now, very prevalent. We saw it in a huge way during COVID-19. And so it's taking these specific moments in history and also in contemporary times and I'm kind of like, you have to look at it, right? Like, we can't just pretend that we're okay in our ethnic bubbles because our kids got into UCLA and we're, actually, this is going to confront us if it hasn't already, and as it has confronted us in the past. And so there's this, like you said, this kind of generational through line that I'm trying to bring together of different moments of Asian diasporic experiences in the U.S., past, present, and future, and put to the forefront how this concept of assimilation has been weaponized and how we can use it and wield it as kind of an alternative path forward, being unassimilable as an alternative path forward to reclaim our agency.
When you think about this work that you do, you think about this current moment we are in and the possibilities for the path forward. What is that demand or that manifesto that you would offer to people of these communities that you care about in terms of saying, make these decisions on your own terms, because that will be the only thing that lasts? What's your message?
It's interesting because I think if you asked me in January, I would have said the same things I say in the book, right? Like we have to demand and create our own belonging. We have to claim our agency on our own terms. And in more cases than none, we have to brute force it, and we have to do it together in community. And that's how we have power. We are now into October of 2025, and a lot has happened. And I think right now I have kind of a different message, because I think me and so many others are honestly very scared. And I think in this moment, I feel a little softer with the manifesto, and I feel the need to kind of make sure that we're all holding on to each other and not disappearing into the fear and isolation and despair and even nihilism of it all. I will even say, I think if the book came out today, I don't know if I would be as brave to say the things I said in January, because again, the circumstances have changed and escalated so much. And so the book is still out there. I'm still standing behind everything I said in the book. But I think the message right now is to really hang on to each other. And I validate and hear the fear that people are feeling, because I feel it too, right? I'm here on this podcast talking about this as I'm trying to get a job in academia. And I just have to trust the process and trust that my family and my community will catch me, that God will catch me, right? I think over the past 10 months, I've been forced to kind of rely and think about even a higher power and community being our higher power and safety net, because the circumstances are really dire. People were getting kidnapped and picked up off the street, but that is happening at an escalated way. And so my urgency right now is to build ecosystems of care, to be connected in mutual aid networks, to be connected to rapid response networks, and to make sure that our neighbors don't just get taken, and that we don't just get taken, that there will be people who will be accountable for us, who will protect us. And we have to be that for each other. And actually that building of safety together is our act of refusal, because otherwise, we see what's happening, right? And we absolutely can't go with the flow. But how we resist it is, again, by building safety for each other.
I so appreciate you for that sentence. We have to hang on to each other. That idea that the universe will conspire for our good. But that sense of grace, to be a little softer with each other, to be a little more patient, not just with other people, but with ourselves, so that we can endure, so that we can navigate whatever challenges, possibilities, and joys in our lives, and be able to embrace it and not just be overwhelmed by it. That, I think, is a manifesto that will help people endure for generations to come. And so we appreciate you for the reminder. Bianca Mabute-Lui is sociologist and author of Unassimilable, an Asian diasporic manifesto for the 21st century. This episode was produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, and Erica McIntosh. Meg Fitzgerald is our Senior Manager of Projects and Radio Programming. Special thanks to our former intern, Tale Ricketson. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive, and you can find us wherever you get your podcast. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.